Matthew Elliott on my far right, who is a senior fellow at Legatum Institute, but it was also the successful chief executive of the Leave campaign in the UK. Pass swiftly on. So that would be one very interesting topic, obviously, for us. Matthew, let's start with you. Passing fad, new political era. What lessons do you learn also out of the Brexit campaign in the UK?
I think it definitely is a new political era. And if you look at sort of British post-war politics, of course you had the post-war consensus defined by Attlee and the creation of the NHS and the welfare state. Then Thatcher came along in the late 70s, early 80s. And this week, of course, marks the 20th anniversary of your election as Prime Minister in 1997. And I think that marked the start of another era, the sort of third way. I was at the LSE at the time, so I remember listening to Anthony Giddens talking about the third way and Bill Clinton coming along and Gerhard Schroeder. And I think you really define the era from that point forward. And everybody from Gordon Brown through to David Cameron were really sort of following in your wake. But I think at the same time, certain concerns from people were being ignored. And this is one of the key factors behind Brexit. I think there was a growth in demand for a referendum. I think people felt that the EU project had gone beyond what it had a democratic mandate for in the UK. There were clearly concerns about migration. I think the numbers of EU migrants coming to the UK were far higher than people thought they would be. And I think all of this culminated in a feeling that the EU wasn't working for the UK. And then, of course, you had the financial crisis added into the whole mix, where the 10 years since the financial crisis, people felt that they'd use their own taxpayers' money to bail out the banks, but then their incomes hadn't started to rise, and in certain sectors they felt that public services weren't working for them and the government weren't providing new homes for them. And all of this culminated in a bit of an anti-establishment feeling, which was the key driver, I think, behind the Leave vote.
I mean, let me just ask you one question, because I think this is one very interesting thing to me about this new politics. To what extent is it driven, as it were, by protest and anxieties over many of the things that you have just articulated? And to what extent is it driven by, as it were, a positive, different way forward? You see what I'm trying to get at there?
I think there were two strands to the Leave vote, which people often forget. Of course, you had the UKIP and Nigel Farage, who had never gone above 30% in any poll, any European poll. And of course, we came along at Vote Leave and produced a very different set of politicians, separate to the UKIP camp, having lots of battles during the referendum with them and lots of fights. But I think we represented with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and business people like James Dyson and Anthony Bamford, even Gisela Stewart, who sat on the European Convention for you back in the early 2000s. A very different set of politicians. People who felt the EU wasn't working for the UK, felt that the UK was now constrained within a protectionist trade bloc, wanted Britain to have a more international, global vision, felt that too many decisions were being made in Brussels rather than the UK. So that was very different. And of course, the two blocs combined added up to 52%.
Yeah. Matthew, so you were saying earlier, which I think is right, that you had these two groups that came together.
Sure.
In order to succeed in Brexit. Once you, I mean, it's not quite the same concept, but it's sort of, once you actually come to the reality, it's a bit like coming to the reality of government. What happens when those two groups find themselves in a different place? And one thing over and beyond that, which I'd be really interested in is, do you think, I'll ask all the panelists, do you think that part of this populism is actually there are new political alliances that will arise out of it?
And when it comes to Brexit itself, I think after the vote on the 23rd of June, Britain could have gone down two paths. It could have gone down the closed Brexit path, which people like Nigel Farage were advocating, or it could go down the open Brexit path, which we're talking about at Vote Leave. And I'm pleased that Theresa May, so far, seems to be accepting the open Brexit path. So in her Lancaster House speech, she wants Britain to be a trading nation right across the world. I think that the government will accept the need for migration to the UK to keep the economy going. Whereas both of those things, I think, wouldn't have happened had it been sort of a more Nigel Farage type vision that had happened. But I think it comes down to thought leadership as well. And if you look at trade policy, going back to the point you were making before, I didn't follow the US presidential election as closely as you did, but I didn't hear Hillary Clinton making the case for the TPP or TTIP. To the contrary, she was also echoing some of those protectionist sentiments. So I think it's really important for all politicians, particularly on the trade front now, to really start battling those forces. In the UK, already you're starting to see some stories in the papers about a US-UK trade deal, how it could be bad for GM foods coming to the UK, how it could mean American companies taking over the NHS. And I think we need to tackle these stories to try and make sure that we get trade.
Yeah, but does it also diminish the quality of the debate? Sum up the policy options for North Korea in a tweet.
Yeah. Can I come in on this?
You can.
I remember the time when you were elected in '97, and there was lots of talk about how you were cheapening debate, and it was all about sound bites. And of course, it was the era of the 24-hour media really coming in. And we were going through a transition whereby you needed rebuttal, you needed to be on top of the media, you needed to be feeding it all the time. I think it's simply the same as that. It's basically moving into a new area of media. And yes, people on the so-called populist side, the Leave campaign or Trump, were better at adapting to the new means of media. But I don't think you can put down the rise of it purely down to the new media. It's
no.
There's a political change.
And look,
well.
Matthew, have you got any thoughts from?
I do. Yeah. I'm looking at it from a UK point of view. I think that the Labour Party's actually really missed out in the past year because it hasn't accepted the result of the referendum. So I think one reason why voters will, I think, reject it quite comprehensively at the election is because they don't listen to the Labour Party because it hasn't accepted the result of the referendum. So whatever it says on other policy issues, it always hasn't got the permission to talk about it. A bit like the Conservatives after '97. They kept on looking back to the previous era of politics when it was Thatcher and Major, and it wasn't until David Cameron came along and accepted how you'd change things that they finally got permission to speak. So I think before you start building this sort of consensus, you have to start accepting the basic principles of what the public have said and actually listen to what they said in this case in the referendum.
I mean, but I think, you could, leave aside whether that's right or wrong for a moment. I mean, I think one thing, though, that is interesting to me is that if you run through many policy challenges, and Brexit is obviously a very big issue in many different ways, although, I understand completely what you're saying, and you may be right in what you're saying, I don't know. But it does seem to be that certain of the policy challenges, virtually whatever country you're in today, are not really left-right challenges. They're actual practical application of, proper analysis and solutions.
One of the things that is in the crosshairs of populism, in my opinion, is everything that was built in the ashes of World War II. I don't really understand why that is. Why is NATO on the chopping block? Why is the UN on the chopping block? Bretton Woods institutions. These are things designed to keep us away from going to war, but yet those are the first things to go in this movement. I was curious if you all had the same sentiment. If so, why or why not? Thank you.
I think it's interesting how the rhetoric of the campaign in the US presidential election is different to what's actually happening. So take NATO, for example. Donald Trump almost sounded like he was going to walk out of NATO the first day he was in office. But in fact, he seems to have come round to it and is really insisting that countries step up to the mark on the 2% point. Look at NAFTA again. It sounded like from the campaign he was going to rip up the agreement on day one, whereas now it seems to be more of a renegotiation and a tinkering. So I think things are changing in a good direction.
just as a last set of remarks, if you could choose one thing which would allow us to make governments themselves more effective institutionally at dealing with the challenges we have ahead, what would it be? Matthew?
It's a tough one, that. I think it's really important to have an opposition, and I actually think it's sad that in the UK the opposition hasn't been more effective in some ways. I think Theresa May will get in with a huge majority, which I'm personally quite pleased about. But I think for a government to be sharp, for it to be accountable and responsive to the wants and desires of people, it does need that alternative power base there, which is capable of challenging the next election. You're holding it to account.
Perfect. We've actually finished absolutely
Bang on time.
So thank you all very, very much for attending the panel, and thank you guys for participating.